Alright guys, what's going on? Today I am going to be showing you guys how to fly a proper traffic pattern and with it involving how to do proper takeoffs and landings. So, uh, one of the first things I start with is, well, everyone starts with, is just setting up your aircraft as much as possible so you have the least amount of tasks to perform in the air. So, what I'm going to start with is just the typical run up. Every time you get into an aircraft and before you take off, you do a before takeoff checklist. And essentially, how that goes is just making sure that your fuel selector is on both. You can start with your fuel shuttle valve should be on, meaning fuel's flowing, and you can start off with your mixture being rich. But essentially, what you're going to do, especially if you're at altitude, like I am, I'm at 5,000 feet above sea level, is I'm going to lean that mixture. And what that does is it really controls my fuel flow. So if I pull, for example, this mixture all the way out, you can actually see my tachometer almost drop to zero. So I start pulling, 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 pulling. I'm taking away fuel. And if I pull too much, there it goes, it drops. So I'm going to push it back in, and essentially all I want to do is look for a balance between um, the fuel and the air. And there's a certain number of parts per molecule, but for the most part, we're just going to look at our tachometer, and we're going to see a small increase in RPMs and then a drop. So what we're looking for is max RPMs. So I'm going to be trying to uh, pull this mixture until um, we get max RPM. So if I can kind of zoom in a little bit for you guys. All right. And so right now I have it set to about 1800 RPMs. And so as I pull that red mixture knob back, you'll see that the RPMs will start to increase. And I'm going to keep pulling back until it decreases. That means I found the peak. That means I found the max RPM. So I'm going to keep pulling back, pulling back, pulling back. I should get about 100 RPMs out of this. Typically at sea level, you just keep it rich, but anything above 3,000 feet, there you go. You see the drop? You're definitely going to want to lean your mixture. So I'm going to push it back in and keep it to what I saw was just about 1,900 RPMs. Cool. All right. So um, let me just check out this. Check something out real quick. Okay. All right. So now that I have my max RPM, I can go ahead and do some tests. And some of the tests I'm gonna do is just gonna be, testing my magnetos, testing my alternator, and all of my systems tests are just gonna happen to be right here in the left side. These are all my systems. We got the ammeter, which tells us the electrical flow, and typically you want it at 0. And you also have the oil pressure and oil temperature gauge, which tells you the temperature and pressure of your oil. So if anything is outside the green, your engine's not doing well, and so you should probably shut down. If you're in the air, land as soon as possible because your engine's about to die. I also have a fuel flow gauge, an engine temperature gauge, and fuel gauge. So right now my fuel levels are at half. My fuel flow is a bit high because I'm revving high RPMs, and if I pull the throttle back, you can actually see that fuel flow drop. But we're going to keep it at 1800 RPMs while we check the rest of the systems. So I have it back at about 1900 RPMs, and one thing I want to do is check my magnetos. My magnetos are here on the left, and it's basically just magnets spinning to create electrical energy, and that's going to give power to the spark plugs. So if I have a full electrical failure with my battery and my alternator, my engine is going to keep running off those magnetos. So I just want to make sure that they are running properly. And the way to do that is just by turning one of them off at a time. So you can see that my key is kind of pointing to both. And if it's pointing to both, that means both magnetos are live. If I turn it to left, it's only going to be my left magneto that is active. And if I do that, we're going to see a drop in RPMs, about 100 RPMs. If you have good magnetos, you probably only see 50. If you have bad magnetos, you're going to see about 150. So you don't want to see that big of a drop. So really, we're just going to be hoping for about a 100 RPM drop or so. So we're looking at my RPMs. It's about 1900 RPMs. And I'm just going to switch to left magneto. And there's the drop. It's about 100, almost 200 RPMs. Now, typically, this is a bad magneto. I probably wouldn't be happy with this at all whatsoever. But I'll bring it back to both. And knowing that this is a simulator and Microsoft has developed all of the physics, I'm not going to expect them to be really accurate with these physics. So we're just going to continue. With the right magneto, if I turn the key to right, you'll see the same drop. There it goes, about almost 200 RPMs, at least 150. So not the best mags, but if you know, hey, look, if it goes out, it's a simulator, right? So our magnetos have been checked, and another thing I'm going to want to check is my alternator. And so my alternator is powered by the alternator belt. Like your car, most batteries are going to be paired with an alternator because batteries are limited in life. And so our battery would only last about 30 minutes by itself. So we have to constantly recharge that. And we do that by taking the engine's rotational movement, attaching a belt, and then using that belt to turn a generator inside the alternator, and that's going to create electrical power and send it to the battery. So our alternator is on the left side of the master switch, the red rocker. So if I just turn the alternator off, you'll actually see my ammeter gauge drop, and that's going to be labeled as amps. So I'll turn that off, and you can see the ammeter completely drop. I turn it back on, and you'll see the ammeter go slightly above 0. That means it's charging. If it's below 0, it's depleting, and ideally you want it at 0. And if it stays above 0, that could be a bad sign saying your alternator is overcharging, and you might be overcharging your battery, which could lead to a bunch of circuit breakers pop in and just an overload on your circuit. So we're eventually going to see that come down, but if you do have an overcharge or even an undercharge, the best way to troubleshoot that problem is to just cycle the alternator, meaning you're just going to turn it off, turn it on, and it should kind of go back to normal. It's like a computer, you just restart for it to work. So those are two tests I definitely want to check before I take off. If your aircraft has carburetor heat, meaning it's not fuel injected, you'll have a little carburetor knob that you would pull and pull open to add heat, push to close the heat, and it'd be typically next to your throttle. But we have fuel injected, and what I can do is just test the fuel pump by, here we go, turning on the fuel pump, and I might see a jump in fuel flow, and I could turn it off, and as long as it's off and the engine's still running, I'm going to assume my fuel pump is working and the engine's working pretty well without it. Every aircraft is going to have at least 2 fuel pumps. You always need a backup, and redundancy is like the #1 thing in aviation. So one is engine driven. That means when the engine runs, the fuel pump will run. But if that fuel pump fails, this one, the one that I can turn on and off, it's actually electrically operated. So it runs off the battery. If I don't have a working alternator or battery, that fuel pump is not going to run. So I'll turn that one off. A couple other things. I definitely want to turn off my pitot heat. I definitely don't need that. And I want to have the proper lights. I don't need navs or strobes. Those are only for night. But I am taking off, so I'm going to put on my landing light. And typically you'll leave your landing light on whenever you're within 10 miles of an airport and below 10,000 feet MSL. So typically when you're flying, just keep the landing light on. A couple other things I'm going to check, right? Just visually is going to be my suction gauge. That's my vacuum system. So next to the ammeter, you can see it says vac. That controls my attitude indicator and my heading indicator. And so as long as that's in the green, I can expect those instruments to be working properly. So my vacuum system's working, my oil pressure and oil temperature are in the green, and everything else looks good. Next, I'm going to move on to my instruments. This is my 6-pack. You can see that there's 6 instruments. My airspeed is at 0 because, well, I'm not moving anywhere. And while I do this, I can actually reduce my RPMs. My attitude indicator is properly erect. It's not kind of skewed, right? And typically you want it within 5 degrees of bank. If it's not, then it's not reliable and you shouldn't use it. It doesn't mean you cannot fly with it. It just means you should not use it, and maybe you should cover it up so you're not fixated on it. The next one is the altimeter in the upper right hand corner. The altimeter tells us our altitude above sea level. Denver is a mile high, so 5,000 feet. And more specifically, I'm at Longmont Airport, which is 5,055 feet. And that's basically what the altimeter is saying. The way to set your altimeter is by setting it to the proper altimeter setting, which you can see in the window. There's inches mercury, and then there's millibars. In the United States, we use inches mercury, and right now the altimeter setting is 29999, so just before 30.00, and that's going to give me the proper altimeter reading. My vertical speed indicator, which tells me feet per minute in climb or descent, is at 0, and it should be at 0. I'm not climbing or descending, so that's good. And that typically just works off the pitot-static system. There's no real system to check. It's kind of like the altimeter. We just assume it's working, and if it's not, we don't necessarily need it. We do need the altimeter, however, and the airspeed indicator, which is on the same system. If the vertical speed indicator tends to be maybe a little bit off away from 0, that's okay. Just kind of make a note of it. So if it's like plus 100 feet, and then your level, you're on the ground, and it shows like you're doing 100 feet per minute climb, just assume that that is 0, and then just start doing math from there on out. So when you start climbing and you see 500 feet per minute, you're really doing 400 feet per minute. My heading indicator is showing the proper heading. I'm lined up on runway 11. While that's the magnetic heading painted on the runway, they round to the nearest 10 degrees. But the the actual magnetic heading is going to be about 115. So you can go ahead and set the heading to that if you know that. And typically that's going to be depicted in any chart supplement, which is a document that you should probably be very knowledgeable of. And then the turn coordinator on the bottom left, typically if it's off, it'll have a red flag, and I can kind of show you that by turning off my battery. There's the red flag. So there's no red flag, so I know it's on. And the ball should be moving freely because it's in a fluid. It's not tied to anything. And we always want to make sure it's always centered while we're flying. And that's how we keep coordination. It's basically kind of telling you where your tail is behind your nose in your path. And so it should always be following your path. If it's a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left, that should give you indication on which rudder to use and how much. So if it's to the right, use right rudder. If it's to the left, use left rudder. Basically, we say step on the ball. So those are our instruments. They all look good. And so we've checked our system, we've checked our instruments, and the last thing we need to do is just check our GPS and transponder. So right now, I have Longmont's communication frequency in, which is 122.975. That's active. On standby, I have the ATIS, or the AWOS. That's the Automated Weather Observation Service. So that's basically telling me the winds, the altimeter setting, all that fun stuff. So I have the most knowledge of the weather available so I can set up my instruments and know where the winds are so I can prepare for that while I'm taking off. Right now the winds are about 0.95, and so it's going to be slightly to my left, but not too much. It's about like 15-20 degrees to my left. You can see that I'm at Longmont. I can kind of zoom in. You can see the airport, and I'm just going to stick around this for my touch and goes. I'm going to be in the traffic pattern here, and I'll just be doing my takeoff and landings here. And more lower, you can see on the very bottom, that's my transponder. Uh, you want it to squawk 1200 because that's a VFR code telling ATC that you are flying under visual flight rules, meaning that you are responsible for your own traffic avoidance and ATC has no control over you. So squawking 1200, and you also see that it says alt for altitude. That means it's going to be reporting my altitude as it reads from the altimeter. So it's taking the information from the altimeter and talking to the transponder, and then the transponder is sending out that information to any radar services that I may be using in the future. Uh, it also, reports it, via ADS-B through the internet, so that if you're on like um, ForeFlight or flight aware or flight radar, or if an aircraft has ADS-B in, they can see your altitude. So it's really helpful for keeping other pilots around you aware of your position. All right, and then one of the last things we're going to look at is our configuration. So we're going to look at our flaps. I have 10 degrees flaps in. That's the max amount of flaps I can have for takeoff. Microsoft kind of sets that in automatically. So um, I'm just going to leave it in because it's useful to practice short field takeoffs. My runway is about, I want to say 4,000 feet. Actually, I could look at it right here. How long is my runway? My runway is 4,799 feet, so just shy of 4,800. And uh, it's not the shortest runway, but it's not a very long runway, especially for Denver, when you don't have a lot of uh, air at this altitude. So the air is thin, so that the aircraft is not going to perform as well, right? So it doesn't have a lot of air to kind of swim in. So that's kind of why we pull the mixture, and that's why it's very useful to use flaps because they do give us more lift. So it's going to help us climb a lot more quickly in terms of incline, so that we can get above obstacles and get off the ground from the runway as soon as possible. Next thing we're going to look at is our trim. You want to make sure that your trim is set for takeoff. So that little white bar should be aligned with the white arrow. And that's just going to make sure that your trim, which is located on your elevator, is flush with your elevator so that it's not causing the elevator to deflect up or down. It's just going to be neutral so that we have full control over our elevator. And as we take off, we'll use the trim to ease the force that is on the yoke. So it just makes it easier to fly. You don't want to fly like gripping the aircraft. You don't want to white knuckle it. We fly with about 3 fingers. These are the fingers I fly with. And so you're not expected to put a lot of force constantly because that'll just kind of tire you out and you're just over controlling the aircraft. You want to be able to almost let go of that yoke and let the plane fly itself. So the trim allows us to do that by releasing the pressure off the yoke because it's a tab that's going to deflect the elevator up or down depending on where you want it. And that's going to be the last thing, so we always come back down and double check, yes, our fuel's on both and our fuel shutoff valve is in, meaning it's on and fuel's flowing. So that's everything, and so now we're set up to take off, and we should expect no problems with our systems or instruments. I have my communication. Typically, you want to communicate as much as possible, especially in an untowered field such as Longmont. It can get very busy, and it's very important to report your position because not everyone is constantly looking outside, even though looking outside and avoiding traffic is our number one responsibility. So while we're doing our systems, we're looking at our instruments, we're looking outside, having other pilots tell us their position in relation to the airport is really critical so that we can keep a mental picture of where everyone is, so that if somebody seems a little bit close, we can take evasive action and avoid any possible collision. So now we're kind of set up. You can see I'm at the end of the runway. All I have to do now is take off. Now, when I take off, I'm going to be expected to maintain a very particular traffic pattern. And the way I'm going to do this is by a control performance method, meaning I'm going to expect to have a certain RPM, a certain flap setting, and a certain airspeed on every leg. And essentially, a traffic pattern is going to look like a rectangle around the airport, with the runway being one of the legs and the downwind being the other leg. So, assuming that the wind is coming towards me, it's kind of like a river, right? If I'm going upstream, I'm going against the flow. So if I'm flying in the air and I'm going against the wind, I'm going upwind. So this leg is going to be my upwind leg. The parallel is going to be my downwind leg. I'm going down with the wind, right? I'm going downstream. So when I hit my downwind leg, I want to be 1,000 feet above the ground. So this changes with every airport. Every airport is going to have 1,000 feet pattern altitudes, but the elevation changes. So right here, I'm at 5,000 feet, so I'm going to be at 6,000 feet pattern altitude. If I was at an airport that was 1,500 feet, my pattern altitude would be 2,500 feet. Everything is based off of above sea level, MSL, mean sea level. So you always have to kind of keep that in your mind. So my altimeter is saying 5,055. No, I don't have to be at 6,055. Anywhere between 900 and 1,000 feet is proper. So 6,000 feet on the dot is a proper pattern altitude, and that's what I'm going to aim for. I'm also going to be expected to make left turns as opposed to right turns. Now, this is standard in every airport, and if they want right turns, they'll let you know that they want right turns. It's going to be published. But if they don't say anything, assume left turns. And this is because, if you notice, I'm on the left side of this cockpit. If I'm on the downwind and I'm making left turns, I can just turn to my left and I'm going to see that runway. So making left turns affords me the best visibility of the runway. So if there's any airplane or obstruction or something on the runway, I have the best view of that. Also, I can see windsocks, so I can gauge where the wind is before I come in for landing. So we're going to do left turns, and because it's like a rectangle, I need to do 90-degree turns. So kind of keeping note of what my departure heading is. Right now it's 115. I'm going to be doing 90-degree turns from there. Now, it could be really hard to do math in the air, and I don't suggest you trying to memorize or come up with it. There's a really easy trick to make sure you're on the proper heading on each leg. The way I do it is I look at my heading indicator and I set my heading bug, this little orange thing that I can manipulate, and I set it to my departure and approach heading. So right there it's lined up, and you'll notice I have like red ticks or orange ticks on every 45 and 90-degree angle. So I can see what my 90-degree heading is going to be. When I turn, that bug is going to move. So if I turn left, that bug is actually going to move right. And I only need to move the bug to the right 90-degree tick. And so when I turn 90 degrees and that bug lines up, I know I made a 90-degree turn. So when I turn downwind, which is parallel, I'm going to have made a 180-degree turn, meaning that heading bug is going to be on the tail of that little airplane icon. So that's how I know I'm on the downwind and parallel of the runway. Now, this is all assuming no wind. You really want to make sure you're correcting for wind, and that's going to be kind of a feel, you're going to have to feel it out. So, if the wind is pushing me towards the runway, I'm going to want to correct a little bit to the right and make sure that I'm not being pushed because essentially I want to be 1 mile from the runway on that downwind and I want to maintain 1 mile because that's going to afford me the most room to turn into the final approach course or approach heading. So wind correction is going to be part of this, and you may see I'm not going to be perfectly on my heading, but I want to be kind of in the ballpark and making sure that I'm keeping proper distance. So knowing that that's my traffic pattern, I can make those calls and I can let people know where I am in that traffic pattern. So right now I'm taking off runway 11. What that communication is going to sound like is Longmont traffic, Skyhawk 123, Sierra Charlie, whatever. Taking off runway 11 for left traffic, meaning I'm doing a left traffic pattern for runway 11, and then I'll just kind of repeat Longmont traffic in case somebody didn't realize I was talking to them. So Longmont traffic, Skyhawk 123, Sierra Charlie, taking off runway 11 left traffic, Longmont. And that would be my communication. It's basically just a simple who am I talking to, who am I, where am I, and what am I doing? All that information is necessary to conduct a safe flight. So now I'm going to start my takeoff, and the way I'm going to do it is in a short field takeoff configuration. So essentially, I'm going to push my throttle all the way forward. You'll see my tachometer increase all the way to the max RPM. I already lean my mixture, so I know I'm good. I have 10 degrees flaps, and I'm going to keep my center line, and I'm going to lift my nose at 55 knots. And once I do that, I'm going to allow the airspeed to accelerate using my pitch to accelerate to 65 knots. Once I reach 65 knots and I run out of runway and I am clear of any obstacles in front of me, then I will take out those flaps, and you'll see me do that. Once I get about 600-700 feet above the ground, that's when I should turn left for my first leg, and that's going to be my crosswind leg. So I go upwind, crosswind, downwind. It's all relative to the wind. And then after the downwind, it's going to be base and final. Base and final are the most crucial points. And that's when I'm going to start changing my power settings, adding some flaps, making sure I'm at a proper airspeed. Once I take out my flaps, I'm going to accelerate to 75 knots. And once I reach 700 feet, I'm going to make that first left turn onto the crosswind. Once I reach 1,000 feet, that's when I'm going to enter the downwind. So I reach 1,000 feet, enter the downwind, and I'll report each leg as well. And then once I'm about, abeam my landing point, meaning my wing is kind of like pointing to my landing point, that's when I'm going to start setting everything up. And again, I'll be reporting my positions, and you'll see that I set my RPMs to a very particular RPM, 1800. I set it to that RPM, and I never touch it again until I'm over the runway. I'll add flaps incrementally, but I'll be managing my airspeed with my pitch. And I'm really trying to pitch for not only an airspeed, but I'm trying also to obtain a specific descent rate, about 500 feet per minute. And so if I'm going to do 500 feet per minute, I'm not going to use my pitch to maintain that. I'm going to use my power to maintain that. So if I do need more or less power, that's going to be dependent on how much I'm descending, if at all, right? So now let's try and put all that into practice, and we'll see how it goes. So my power is full. My flaps are 10. I'm ready for takeoff. Runway's clear. I already announced my intentions to Longmont, so I'm going to release my parking brake. Alright. My engine instruments are in the green, and we can see that just kind of by looking down my engine instruments. My oil temp is a little bit high, but hey, like I said, it's Longmont, or it's a simulator. So my airspeed's alive, it's coming alive, so that's something to note. If you don't have an airspeed indication, definitely do not fly. So I reach 55 knots. I'm going to bring that nose up. And essentially, I'm going to see that I want my dash kind of like on the horizon. And now I'm at 65 knots. I want to trim that out so that I'm not fighting the yoke. I'm not like pulling on the yoke. I can be hands off and maintain that airspeed. All right. And so now I ran out of runway. I'm clear of all trees and obstacles in front of me. So I'm going to take out those flaps. And now I'm going to accelerate to 75 knots. So my power is full. My flaps are up. Longmont traffic, Skog 123, Sierra Charlie is on the upwind, runway 11, left traffic, Longmont. Alright, so I'm slowly accelerating to 75 knots. I think my trim up is a little bit too much. So now I'm accelerating to 75 knots. I'm going to hold that using my pitch, and I'm going to hold that pitch using my trim. So now I'm hands off. You can see my airspeed is pretty steady. We've reached about 700 feet now, and so I'm going to make that first left turn. And it's just going to be a nice gentle turn. 15, 20 degrees of bank. You can use 30. You really don't need it. Nice and easy is better. You don't want to overwhelm yourself. So I'm trying to keep that 75 knots all the way through the climb. And you can see on my heading indicator that my heading bug is almost to my right 90 degrees. So I'm going to start that rollout a little bit early. I'm still at 75 knots, but now I've reached pattern altitude. So typically, when you reach pattern altitude, you've reached your your downwind leg as well. So we're just going to go ahead and turn downwind, and I'm going to make sure that I'm keeping my altitude, my pitch, and I should probably lower my power just a little bit because we don't stay full throttle all the time. So I'm just going to reduce my power in order to maintain a specific altitude. Now, I'm going to keep turning until my heading bug is on my tail. I could also use visual references on the ground that'll help me kind of keep my pattern. And you can see on my left side is a train track, and that train track actually does run parallel to the runway. And I always teach my students, hey, just fly the train track and you'll be fine. And the train track is about a mile north of the runway, so I know it's a good distance too. So if we kind of look inside, you can see that my heading bug is on the tail of my aircraft, and I'm maintaining more or less 6,000 feet pattern altitude. Longmont traffic, Skyhawk 123 Sierra Charlie is left downwind, runway 11, touch and goes, Longmont. So that's who I'm talking to, that's who I am, that's where I am, and what am I doing. So people know I'm coming back for a touch and go. That means I'm going to land and take off again. So now I look to my left, I see that my wing is abeam my landing point. So now I can set up for landing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull my power to about 1800 RPMs. Once I do that, you can see that the nose starts to come down. I'm below 110 knots, so I'm going to add my first 10 degrees of flaps. And you'll notice my nose comes right back up. That's because flaps give us lift. Once I do that, I'm just going to wait until either my landing point is on my rear 45 degrees, which it's about, or I've reached about, 800 feet over the ground. But essentially, you do that, and you're already ready to turn. I'm going to turn another 90 degrees until my heading bug is on my left 90 degree tick, but I'm also going to kind of pull up and slow down to about 85 knots so I can put in my 20 degrees of flaps because it has a speed limit. So I've turned left, I've made my 90 degree turn, I can level out, I'm below 85 knots, I'm going to put in 20 degrees of flaps, and once I do this, I can just go ahead and start turning inbound. I rather undershoot than overshoot my runway. And so now I'm maintaining 75 knots, and that is what you should strive for on the base leg and final. Longmont traffic, Skyhawk 123, Sierra Charlie is turning final for runway 11, Longmont traffic. So I've overshot. I don't want to increase bank angle. I'm just going to correct where I can. If it's too much, I'll just go around. So now I'm a little bit high. I can kind of reduce my power, increase that descent rate, but I also want to decrease my airspeed for a final approach speed of 65 knots. So I'm going to hold my pitch almost level. I'm going to add 30 degrees flaps. I reach 65 knots. I'm going to relax that yoke to maintain 65 knots. And we can see the white over white lights. is saying I'm too high. So I can just use my pitch to gain some airspeed, gain some altitude. I've now gotten too low and too slow. So I'm going to add power, kind of hold off, don't go below 60 knots. And now once I'm over the runway, I'm going to bring that power to idle. I'm just going to let the plane settle by itself as I bring up the nose and stay level with the runway and slightly nose high. And touchdown. Once you touch down, you want to bring out those flaps because that'll take out a lift and it'll make it a lot easier to keep your wheels on the ground. Now I can take off and do the same thing over again. So I go full throttle. Longmont traffic, 123 Sierra Charlie is taking off, runway 11, left traffic Longmont. So there's 55 knots. I'll take off again. I'll climb at 65 knots. I'll use the trim so I'm not like holding that yoke so much, right? I want to be like kind of casual on the yoke. And we're clear of obstacle, flaps are up. And like I said before, we're just going to climb up to 700 feet before making our first turn. Alright, so you can see on the instruments, keeping 65 knots, I'm back to my heading, I'm climbing, and once my altimeter says 5,700, I'll make that first turn. So if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat. Alex, what's up? Happy to see you again. I hope you caught most of that, doing some takeoff and landings, and I'll do a couple more before I head out. So we're climbing up to about 700 feet above the ground and before we make our first turn. So here we are approaching the altitude, and now I'll just make my first turn. 90 degrees, and I'm using my heading bug and the tick marks inside my heading indicator to determine that I have made a 90-degree turn. Alright, I've made my 90-degree turn. I'm climbing between 65 and 75, typically right now I'm climbing at 70, which is okay for a normal climb out. And I reached 6,000, so I'm going to lower that nose, I'm going to reduce that power a little bit, and then I'm going to turn onto my downwind. Alright, and I'm going to trim that out so that my nose doesn't stay up. So I'm turning only until my heading bug is on my rear 180 degrees. So there it goes. My heading bug is on my 180. I'm aligned with that train track that I'm using as a visual cue to make sure that I am 1 mile away from the runway and also parallel. Not every airport is going to have a visual cue like this, but whatever airport you're at, you definitely want to look for one. I'm maintaining about 90 knots on the downwind, which is an appropriate speed to be in the traffic pattern. You don't really want to be too much faster than that. My nose is still coming up and I'm still climbing, so I'm going to push that nose down and trim. I can also reduce some power. Power will make sure that I don't actually I don't nose up. Okay, so now Longmont traffic, 123 Sierra Charlie's left downwind for runway 11, touch it goes, Longmont. So now I'm about midfield, and I'm going to wait until my wing is abeam my landing point. So I'm still maintaining pattern altitude. Good. And now I'm about abeam my landing point. There it is. So now I'm going to start my landing procedure, which is bring my power to about 1800 RPMs. I'm going to add 10 degrees flaps, and I'm going to kind of strive for about 85 knots. So we're about 85 knots. I've kind of done this almost hands off. And we want to kind of trim that out so we keep about a 500 feet per minute descent and also 85 knots. Once we accomplish that, just go ahead and start turning because you're going to be on the 45, or your landing point is going to be on your rear 45. So now we're descending. You don't want to descend too quickly. My power is a little bit low, so we're going to make sure it's at 1800 RPMs. And again, it's just a nice easy turn until my heading bug is on my left 90 degrees. Alright, there we go. We're 90 degrees. We're going to bring those wings level. We're going to add 20 degrees flaps because we're below 85 knots. And once you kind of have that in, you're slowing down to 75 knots, and you can go ahead and make that third or fourth final turn. Third. or fourth. Yeah, fourth and final turn. Cool. So now we're doing a 500 feet per minute descent. We're casually turning to our final approach heading. I think I overshot it again, which is fine. You don't want to increase your bank angle. So here I've definitely overshot it, and I think that's just because the wind is pushing me. So we'll probably have to increase bank angles on those turns as we come in. So I'm at 75 knots. I'm going to add my last degree of flaps. My power is the same, 1800 RPMs. We're going to slow down to about 65 knots, and we're going to continue the approach, this wildly overshot approach. And because I'm a little bit high, I'm just going to reduce my power and keep my airspeed with my pitch attitude. All right. So I'm a little bit low and slow again. Let's add some power. And then once we're over the runway, we're going to take that power out. We're going to keep that airspeed. And as we get close to the runway, we're going to start picking up that nose. And just let it land by itself. All right. Wheels down, flaps up. Cool. And that's a traffic pattern. So we're going to do that one more time. Full throttle, flaps are up. Airspeed's alive. It's 55 knots and rotate. Alright, climbing at 65. And I would say it's actually probably harder to do this in a simulator because you don't have that real feel. You don't really feel anything on your yoke. There's no really force feedback. Other simulators are really good, those certified by the FAA. Those are going to give you a better view, but again, it doesn't replace real life. So when you're in the aircraft, you're just really trying to look for all of the indications, the airspeed, the power settings, the altimeter, the heading indicator. You just want to look for those to make sure that you're doing everything right. And I can even accelerate to 75 knots. There we go, 75 knots and climbing. All right, Alex, I'll see you next time. Buen provecho. All right, so we're at 700 feet. We're going to turn, make that 9 degrees turn. Longmont traffic, Cessna 123, Sierra Charlie is turning left crosswind for runway 11, touch it goes, Longmont. All right, there's our 90 degrees. We'll level our wings. We've reached pattern altitude. We'll lower our nose. We'll reduce our power to keep pattern altitude. We'll trim it out, making sure we're not fighting the yoke. And then we'll just go ahead and turn downwind. I'm also going to be posting this video on YouTube, so if you miss anything, just go to our YouTube page and this video will be posted right after the stream. Alright, there's my 180 degrees on my heading. There's the railroad, so I know I'm about a mile out. My power seems a little bit high. I'm kind of fighting the yoke here, so I'm going to trim it out a bit. Alright. And like I said before, this is the control performance method. So as long as you're hitting your airspeed, your headings, your altitude, and your RPMs, you're going to be able to run traffic patterns perfectly. It's basically a science. Alright, so we're midfield, Longmont traffic, Cessna 123 Sierra Charlie is left downwind for runway 11, touch and goes, Longmont. Alright. So because I've been overshooting the runway on final approach, I think I'm going to give myself a little bit more room. I'm going to come out a bit, and once my wings are a beam landing point, I'll start my landing procedure. So here we are, come inside the cockpit. I'll reduce my power to 1800 RPMs, and what I'm going to do also, I'm going to increase my bank angle to about 30 degrees because the wind is pushing me more south. So now I have that nose lowering. I'm going to put in 10 degrees flaps. I'm going to reduce my airspeed to about 85 knots. Alright, and once that's trimmed down, I'm at 85, almost a 500 feet per minute descent. And I have my configuration set. I think I'm at 1700 RPM, so I'm gonna pick that a little bit up. Okay, now I can turn 90 degrees. Longmont traffic, Skyhawk 1230 Charlie is turning left base for runway 11. Touch it goes. So I'm increasing my bank angle between 20 and 30 degrees. Making sure I still have control over my pitch to keep my airspeed. So there's my 90 degrees. I'm going to put in 20 degrees flaps. I'm going to reduce my airspeed to 75 knots. There's my 75 knots, 500 feet per minute descent, and then we're just going to go right into the turn. I'd rather make a turn too soon than too late. So there I am. There's the runway. Just a little bit early, but again, that's good. And now that we're on final, Longmont traffic 1230 Charlie is on final runway 11. Touch and goes. I'm gonna put in 30 degrees flaps. I look a little bit high, so I'm just gonna reduce my power to about 1500 RPMs. I want to reduce to 65 knots, so it's all about my pitch. Once I have that, I want to make sure that I'm controlling that with my trim. I'm keeping that 65 knots airspeed. So now that I'm coming in, I should be able to see my landing point right above my dash, just how I see it. And so now, as I come over the runway, I'm going to reduce my power. There's the runway, power reduced. I'm going to level my nose with the runway. And as I sink more, I'm going to bring my nose up more and more. And there we are on the runway, flaps up. And full throttle. So I'm going to do this about 2 more times, just so you guys can get an idea. And in about 15 minutes, I'm going to sign off. So here we go, 55 knots. Trim it out, climbing at 65. Hands free. Longmont traffic, Skyhawk 123 Sierra Charlie is on the upwind runway 11 left traffic, Longmont. Alright, clear of obstacle, no more remaining runway. I'm going to accelerate to 65 knots. I'm sorry, 75 knots. Climbing up to 700 feet above the ground. There's 700 feet. I'm going to turn left 90 degrees, keeping my airspeed. There's my 90 degrees. Alright. And my airspeed got a little bit low, but here's my pattern altitude. I'm going to lower that nose. I'm going to reduce my power just a little bit. I'm going to trim it out. Alright, everything looks good. I'm going to turn 90 degrees once more, entering the left downwind. Longmont traffic, 123 Sierra Charlie is left downwind for runway 11, touch and goes, Longmont. There's my visual reference, the railroad. There's my 180 degrees. I'm going to wings level, keep my nose down, try and keep my pattern altitude. I'm a little bit high. I think it's just my power setting. 2300 RPMs typically is a good RPM to keep level flight. 90 knots. Alright. Longmont traffic, 123 Sierra Charlie is left downwind, runway 11, touch and goes, Longmont. Alright, I'm I'm going to keep a little bit distance because the wind kind of pushes me in. I tend to overshoot. I'm midfield. I'm going to be waiting until my wing is level with my landing point. Alright, my wing is level with my landing point. So now I'm going to start that landing procedure. I'm going to bring my power 1800 RPMs, let that nose drop by itself. We're below 110 knots. We're going to add 10 degrees flaps. Yes, that nose comes up. I'm going to slow down to 85 knots. Make sure that nose does come back down though. You will have to work it and trim it out so that it's a steady descent and steady airspeed. So there you go, 85 knots, 500 feet per minute, 1800 RPMs, and 10 degrees flaps. Once that's in, go ahead and make your turn. I'm going to do about 20 degrees bank. Keeping my airspeed with my pitch. There's my left 90 degrees. So I'll come wings level. We're going to add 20 degrees flaps, slowing down from 85 to 75 knots along my traffic. Cessna 123 Sierra Charlie is left base for runway 11 touch and goes. So there's 75 knots, 500 feet per minute descent. We got 20 degrees flaps in, so now we're going to go ahead and turn into final. Longmont traffic, Cessna 123 Sierra Charlie is turning final. Runway 11 touch and goes, Longmont. So now I'm slowing down to 75 knots and I'm keeping in my turn. There's the runway. There's my heading. So we're going to come wings level. We're going to add 30 degrees flaps. We're going to slow down to 65 knots. Alright, there's 65 knots. My landing point is just above my dash, so it's in sight. Coming in a little steep, 700 feet per minute, but that's not bad. I am a little bit high, so I'm going to reduce that power to 1500 RPMs, keeping that 65 knots airspeed. Once I'm over the runway, we're going to reduce that power to 0. We're going to bring that nose level with the runway. And we're just going to let it settle by itself. Nose slightly high, wheels down, flaps up, throttle full. And we'll do this one more time. There's 55 knots, climb out, 65 knots. Alright, positive rate of climb. No more remaining runway. Clear of obstacles. We're going to accelerate to 75 knots. Longmont traffic, Skyhawk 123 Sierra Charlie is on the upwind runway 11 left traffic, touch and goes Longmont. Alright, there's 700 feet. So we're going to make our first 90-degree turn to the left, keeping our airspeed. Alright, there's 90 degrees. Still climbing at 75 knots. There's pattern altitude, so we're going to lower our nose. We're going to reduce our power. We're going to trim it out. Alright. And once we do that successfully, we're going to go ahead and turn to our 180 degree heading. keeping our altitude and airspeed. Alright, there's our 180 degrees. There's our train tracks. We're keeping altitude. Longmont traffic, 123 Sierra Charlie is left downwind, runway 11, touch and goes. Or we're going to make this one full stop. Alright, so we're trimmed out, maintaining altitude, good heading. We're entering about midfield and we'll be abeam our landing point very shortly. And like I said, I'm going to kind of give myself some room because I don't want to overshoot because the wind is going to be pushing me to the south. Alright, we passed our landing point, so we're going to bring our power to 1800 RPMs. We're going to let that nose drop. We're going to add 10 degrees flaps because we're below 110 knots. We achieve 85 knots in a 500 feet per minute descent. We want to trim that out, make sure we keep that performance. Alright, looks good. I think I'm a little bit low on RPMs, so we're going to add that. And then we're going to go ahead and turn base. 123 Longmont traffic, 123 Sierra Charlie's turning left base, runway 11, full stop, Longmont. I'm going to increase my bank angle because the wind is kind of causing me to overshoot, so I'm going to do about 20-degree bank angle, making sure we're keeping our airspeed with our pitch. 85 knots. There we go, there's 90 degrees, 85 knots, and we're going to add 20 degrees flaps. We're going to slow down to 75 knots and then trim that out. Once you have that trimmed out, go ahead and make that fourth and final turn. Longmont traffic, 123 Sierra Charlie is turning final, runway 11, full stop, Longmont. Alright, there's my heading, there's my runway. I want to be at 75 knots. We're going to add 30 degrees flaps, and we're going to slow down to 65 knots. Alright. Alright, we're a little high, so I'm reducing my power. We're at 65 knots. I'm going to use my pitch to maintain that. I'm going to keep my power around 1600 RPMs. Alright, good glide slope, 65 knots over the runway. And we're going to bring our power to idle. We're going to start to bring that nose level with the runway. And as we sink further, we're going to keep pulling up that nose until we're landing nose high. Alright, wheels down, flaps up, and we're going to apply brakes. And that's it. That's how you do a traffic pattern. That's how you do performance takeoffs and landings. And that's the control performance method of flying. So if you guys have any questions, we have a Discord. It's Fly High Aviation, and we also have an Instagram, flyhigh.denver. Give us a follow. Ask any questions you want, DM, comment, and we're happy to answer. Give free flight training advice, no cost to you, so you guys can save the most money possible. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop it in the comment section, send a message, chat us up, and I am happy to answer your questions 24/7. So, here we are at Longmont. We've just done a couple touch and goes, and yeah, Hopefully when you guys start flying and you guys implement this method, takeoff and landings will be a breeze. All right. My name is Colin, your personal flight instructor, and it was a pleasure teaching you guys how to take off and land. All right. You guys have a good night.